talking blues, climb the fence, books and pens. I can tell that we are gonna be friends.
Marta? All the information you need is here. Marta Cooper, journalist, very experienced journalist, cutting-edge journalist, from working on 3 continents at different stages of... only 3, I'm afraid, in this instance, yeah? She comes to us from the Index on Censorship in London and from Global Voices Online, which brings together citizen journalists in the virtual space. Very interesting site that I have only now just discovered. And Marta's going to be telling us about journalism in the age of new media, implications for freedom of expression.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I was going to introduce myself, but I think Peter's done a lovely job. So I'll be talking about journalism in the age of new media and the effects. Thank you. The effect this has on freedom of expression. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Okay, so just a very quick introduction. Journalism has undergone nothing short of a revolution in recent years, with greater public engagement through a growth of participatory media such as blogs, forums, user-generated content, crowdsourcing, social networking, and mobile technologies, amongst others. Traditional news journalism has become less of a linear top-down product and more of a collaborative, interactive, and multi-directional process. And these changes, of course, throw up some rather fundamental questions about journalism. What is it for? What is its value to society? Who is a journalist? And what implications do these changes have on freedom of expression? So using a few case studies illustrating the rise of what can be termed social media-based journalism, and highlighting Global Voices, the organization I'm representing, which is a community of more than 500 bloggers and translators from around the world, and where I'm very fortunate to sit on the board of directors, I want to show how we're really in the midst of a democratic, more open, if at times it has to be said, rather chaotic model of news gathering. And this model really includes voices that mainstream journalism has often ignored in the past. And of course, while no model of journalism is perfect, and this archetype too does have its flaws, it is undeniable that journalism is now really sort of embracing this opportunity to fulfill its democratic purpose. And as journalists and consumers and those who cross both bridges, we really do have more chances and outlets than ever before to actively exercise our right to freedom of expression. So, to journalism's identity crisis. Simply, the boundary between the reporter and the reader has now been blurred. Web 2.0 technologies are largely to blame for this, for lowering the cost of entry to the journalistic sphere. So with smartphones, anybody can be a photographer. With the rise of the blogosphere, anyone can be a publisher. And with social networking sites like Facebook and Twitter and online curation tools such as Storify, we can all become part of a more interactive conversation, source contacts, and find material to build stories. As a result, as I mentioned in the introduction, news journalism, or at least in its traditional sense, has become far less of a top-down product and more of an interactive process. But is this identity crisis really cause for concern? If we are to strip journalism down to its bone, to its very core, its duty is really about seeking to tell the truth. And commercial pursuits aside, journalism rests on sourcing and presenting truth to its readers in a coherent and accurate manner. And we, as citizens, make decisions based on the information we are both fed and that we actively seek out. So it's very fair to say that journalism matters. So rather than sending journalism into a sort of neurotic haze, I'd like to argue that the opportunities presented, which I'm sure you'll discuss tomorrow, I'd like to argue that the opportunities presented by Web 2.0 technologies are really giving it the chance to live up to its potential and seek truth in more diverse and participatory ways than ever before. And there are hordes of professional journalists and mainstream outlets who have really come to terms with the reality that they now have to share their craft with members of the audience. A good example of this would be Al Jazeera's The Stream, which aggregates online sources and discussion from social media. It, quote, seeks unheard voices, new perspectives from people on the ground, and untold angles related to the most compelling stories of the day. And it is broadcast on Al Jazeera 4 days a week. By assisting its viewers traverse the social media terrain by giving advice on using tools such as Storify, as I mentioned, and helping them discover new online tools, the stream is actively encouraging its audience to become part of the news agenda. And the importance of microblogging platforms such as Twitter to the traditional news agenda is now well known and oft discussed, particularly in the Western press. One pertinent example comes from London. As the summer riots ripped furiously across the country in August, a reporter from The Guardian, Paul Lewis, used Twitter to track developments across the capital. He wrote soon after, "It enabled us to deliver real-time reports from the scene, but more importantly, enabled other users of Twitter to provide constant feedback and directions to trouble spots. While journalists covering previous riots would chase ambulances to find the front line, we followed what people on social media told us." And recent research into the riots by The Guardian and the London School of Economics has shown that the platform was also used to debunk rumours that were spreading across the city almost as quickly as the riots themselves were. For instance, reports circulated that rioters had broken into London Zoo, owing to a single poorly lit picture of what appeared to be a tiger on a stairwell with the subject line, "Oh my God, reports of tigers roaming around Primrose Hill," which I'm sure most Brits will know is a rather affluent part of North London. And this screenshot shows some of the data that they were investigating with, it's not really very clear, I apologize, with the circles representing the level of support or query for a particular tweet. And the research goes on to explain, a Twitter user with good memory spotted similarities between the picture in question and shots taken of a big cat that had escaped from a circus in Italy in 2008, and even linked to a news article about the earlier incident, but not before nearly 1,000 people had retweeted the story. With some rumours, certain key tweets proved influential. So with this example in mind, traditional news formats, particularly breaking news, now has more platforms than ever before. Twitter and Storify are ideal for tracking developments and incorporating rolling coverage, while live blogging, which is a method really widely used by various British national papers, including The Guardian and The Telegraph, really maintains the immediacy of breaking developments. And incorporating these, as a 2010 paper on networked journalism published by media think tank Polis has shown, quote, satisfies the public's demand for immediacy while building in reflection, context, and a diversity of perspectives. To quote online media company GigaOn, platforms such as Twitter are like a crowdsourced newswire, filled with everything from breaking news to rumour and everything in between, and one that both uses and is used by mainstream media. This perhaps more demanding addition to the news agenda might send some of us into a confused frenzy, with the borders of traditional media no longer being as clearly demarcated as they once were. And indeed, mainstream outlets in the West are very aware of this. Earlier this month in the UK, Sky News told its journalists not to repost any information from Twitter users who are not an employee of the broadcaster. And the intention, Sky said, was to ensure that our journalism is joined up across platforms. There is sufficient editorial control of stories reported by Sky News journalists, and that the news desks remain the central hub for information going out on all our stories. And while this move has faced criticism for perhaps taking the social out of social media, it could also be said that the guidelines don't necessarily prohibit Sky reporters from using Twitter as a news gathering tool at the very least. Because fundamentally the point is that in the midst of this sort of social media chaos, we as journalists are spoiled with a wider pool, a wider and more easily accessible pool of potential sources than ever before. While financial pressures and the culture of the 24-hour newsrooms means that there are far fewer of us doing more work, we now have larger and more diverse sources of news and information. And by engaging more with our audience as sources, journalism as a product that is there to serve its readers inevitably improves. And so I'd like to now look at voices on the ground. And, oops, sorry about that. Oops, okay, sorry. I did this on a Mac, so the formatting is slightly different. Okay, so with the exponential rise of such tools, prominent bloggers and online activists now have the means to build their credibility, gain followers, and become crucial conduits of information, reinforcing their significance as on-the-ground sources of stories. And nowhere has the power of social media been catapulted more so than during the events of the Arab Spring. And I'd just like to draw your attention to a recent study entitled "The Revolutions Were Tweeted, Information Flows During the Events of the Arab Spring." Information flows during the 2011 Tunisian Egyptian revolutions, which was published at the end of last year. And I'll just quote briefly from the research. So researchers looked at two data sets, One was composed of 168,000 tweets from the 12th to the 19th of January that contained the hashtags Sidi Bouzid and Tunisia, and one composed of 230,000 tweets from the 24th to the 29th of January, which contained the hashtags Egypt or January the 25th, which was the date for mass demonstration that played an enormous role in the subsequent Egyptian revolution. And the research then broke those who tweeted about the events down into a number of groups of so-called key actors, and this included activists, mainstream media outlets, individual journalists, bloggers, and even celebrities. And then it tracked how information about various events during both periods flowed from one source to another. And the conclusions that were made were that news on Twitter was being co-constructed in a way by bloggers and activists alongside mainstream media and reporters. And the platform therefore played a key role in the way news functioned during events such as the Egyptian revolution. And to quote from the research briefly, "This confirms the notion that Twitter supports distributed conversation among participants, and these conversations hold a host of interested parties, those directly experiencing events, mainstream media searching for on-the-ground information, and general interest readers." It concluded that mainstream media's use of Twitter suggested that news does not emerge from a single pool of sources, but rather from a hybrid information network whose structures and influences change depending upon how a variety of actors behave. These actors working together can constitute a particular kind of online press. And such developments also make for greater transparency and a far deeper human connection than was allowed for in traditional journalism. By encouraging citizen participation and feedback, the journalist is no longer the gatekeeper of news, and the barrier between the producer and the consumer has broken. To quote scholar Zeynep Tufekci, "The visibility of the process in social media-based journalism makes it more open to criticism and errors, which are also more visible. This transparency should be seen as a movement for improvement, not for returning back to the days of more opaque, unclear paths." And Tufekci makes a rather convincing case for this argument, and I'll just quote her study very briefly. On the 29th of November of last year, mainstream reporters had tweeted that arrested Egyptian activist and blogger Alaa Abdel Fattah had been charged with murder on top of other charges previously announced for his role in the Maspero demonstrations on October the 9th. A Storify stream, which I've just screen grabbed here, created by NPR digital strategist Andy Carvin, shows that reporters at Al Jazeera English were citing Egypt's Arabic language Shuruk News as the source. And they were the first few to tweet that Alaa had been charged with premeditated murder and terrorism. And following a few others tweeting the same, Carvin joined in and spread his news to a network of over 60,000 followers. And following his request for a translation of the original Shuruk piece, combined with input from other Twitter users, including Alaa's sister and media professor Rasha Abdullah, the original reports were eventually debunked. And it turned out that the murder charges were not, in fact, for Alaa, but for those who had been charged at the same time with him. And what was really interesting about this case was that Carvin, who is a really ideal example of a middleman who can help us to wade through truth versus rumor on Twitter, he sort of debriefed with his followers. He asked them if he'd been initially right in tweeting the news from the mainstream that Alaa had been charged with murder, asking his followers if the tweets had made the situation worse, ultimately helped solve it, or a combination of both. And the response was largely positive, with Carvin really being reassured of his modus operandi, being told that he had reported events based on the best available information at the time, and that he was meticulous and swift in asking corrections and correcting himself. Zeynep Tufekci tweeted afterwards, "I don't think we would have gotten a correction this fast if you hadn't started asking. The question is how to make sure people hear the correction." Referring to the inaccuracies in the original report, Rasha Abdullah responded, "Actually, it tells us that citizen journalists are sometimes much more accurate than traditional ones." And this use of Twitter to not only check facts and encourage readers to participate in live coverage by guiding reporters has also been used by the New York Times. One example comes from the US presidential election, when the paper encouraged readers to use the hashtag AskNYT, which would denote a topic of discussion and generate debate, to flag up certain statements that they thought should be fact-checked. Another recent case alluded to by Director of Police Charlie Beckett comes from the UK and also shows how transparency and a more networked reach of social media can bolster really good old-fashioned journalism and turn it into a campaign. So very briefly, on the afternoon of the 24th of January, the hashtag LA Fitness, which is a very popular gym chain in the UK, began to trend on Twitter. And it transpired that the gym was facing copious amounts of criticism over its insistence that a pregnant woman and her newly redundant partner continue to hold their 24-month gym contract, as reported by The Guardian's consumer affairs correspondent, Lisa Batchelor. The gym tweeted that it does not comment on individual cases, which fanned the flames of criticism even further. And in a manner much reviled on Twitter, LA Fitness then deleted this tweet. So with this blend of Twitter outrage and the willingness of several Guardian readers to contribute to the couple's fees, the gym eventually buckled and offered to waive their claim to the couple's membership costs. And so in this example, the sort of network outreach of social media is really ideal for holding corporations to account and bolstering journalism 101 into a campaign. But this new era of journalism as a process, as I've said, this perhaps something of a golden age, which is seen as bringing more civil society actors and merging them with traditional storytellers, is by no means perfect, and I would argue no news media model is. Today's nature of news is frankly chaotic. Both straight-up consumers, those who straddle the line between professional reporter and blogger, and the old guard themselves are dealing with a torrent of information. We're constantly wading our way through hard news versus PR, managing an endless stream of tweets and pictures that we seem to have for far less time to view in full. And this chaos raises some really key issues that go to the heart of journalism as a craft, particularly source verification and editorial objectivity. So with this torrent of information, how do we verify that the author of this tweet or the uploader of this picture, who are they, what is their angle, what is their story? So these issues of the provenance of a source are now more pressing. And in many ways too, the chaos means that it's also far easier for us to become lazy. We can rehash reports that are linked to elsewhere, which leads us to ask whether we are in fact seeing the growth of an echo chamber of news rather than a more diverse conversation. And so to help us wade through this mud, we really need a middleman, and we need professionals to help us evaluate the information presented to us and differentiate truth from rumor. And Andy Carvin, as I mentioned, is a great example of this. And the organization I represent, Global Voices, also acts as a middleman, a sort of networked newsroom which bridges alternative and mainstream media. And I'll talk about it very shortly, but I'd just like to play a short video which will help describe more about what we do. I'm not sure if there's any audio. There should be. Is there any audio at all? Oh, thank you. Even Peter Gabriel likes us, which is good enough for my dad. Global Voices was established in 2005, and it comprises a community of over 500 bloggers and translators around the world who together bring you reports from blogs and citizen media. I joined the team in October 2009, pitching a very whittled down version of my master's thesis on women's alternative media in Brazil to the then Portuguese language editor. And I contributed to Global Voices while I was living in Shanghai, where I was studying Chinese media and blogging. And having held temporary regional editor and long-term sub-editor positions, I was fortunate enough to be elected as one of 2 volunteer representatives on the board of directors last year. So Global Voices is translated into more than 30 languages by volunteer translators who form the Lingua project. We have an advocacy website to network and help people speak out online in places where their voices are censored. And our outreach project, Rising Voices, has been set up to help marginalized communities use citizen media to be heard. And there's a particular emphasis here on the developing world. For me, Global Voices' primary strength is that it really bridges the gulfs that divide people, both by giving a platform to unheard citizen voices and by translating content into a multitude of languages. So for example, if someone in Rome wants to read about the latest stories in sub-Saharan Africa translated from Swahili to Italian, then they have a port of call. And in a world with a shrinking number of foreign correspondents, platforms such as GV really help to fill a crucial void, not by replacing the role of a foreign correspondent, but by supplementing their work through documenting what citizens across the globe are saying. But of course, like any news organization, Global Voices is not perfect. Managing a regional and linguistic team across several different time zones and entirely virtually is far harder than yelling copy across the office. And building ties virtually also places a far greater premium on trust and ensuring that the author of a story is credible. By having regional editors and sub-editors and a core team spanning the fields of journalism and technology, we somehow managed to cope with such challenges. 2011 was monumental for Global Voices in terms of its coverage across the Middle East and North Africa. I've already mentioned how tools such as Twitter were instrumental in organizing protests and spreading news of the tumult in the region across foreign ears. But what Global Voices writers and translators in the Arab world tirelessly did was sift through the Arab blogosphere, engage with their fellow citizen media practitioners, and curate and distill what was being said into posts for English language readers. These posts were then in turn translated into several other languages that GV's Lingua team covers. As a result, not only did they tell their stories from the ground, but they also gave mainstream media outside the region a clear, distilled body of sources that they themselves could contact or refer to for news, which therefore fulfills the dual function of cyberjournalism that I mentioned earlier, providing reporters with a wider body of sources and incorporating more voices into the news agenda. And fundamentally, at Global Voices' heart and at the core of this conference is the principle of freedom of expression, which Global Voices addresses through looking at the inequities in traditional news media by encouraging and cultivating citizen voices. Indeed, in countries where citizens do not have the privilege of speaking freely, citizen journalism really becomes a counterweight to state media. We have seen this in recent years in China, a country with around 500 million internet users, who are increasingly using online spaces as a public sphere for conversation, critique, and in some cases dissent. But the Communist Party is indeed they've really cracked onto this, and while China retains one of the world's most sophisticated online censorship apparatus, they've really engaged with netizens online to gauge public sentiment. So especially during Wen Jiabao's premiership, he held very many online chats with netizens. Tunisia too is opening up more avenues for freedom of expression. Last year alone, it rose 30 places in Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. Of course, here there is much work to be done. Training needs to be improved, directed into the right channels and made more efficient, but new standards for communication are being developed. However, as my fellow board member Gillian C. York has pointed out, and as my colleagues at Index on Censorship in London have been documenting, 2011 was an incredibly difficult year for freedom of expression in the region and as the scene of such fervent online activism. Two notable cases among many come from Egypt. Blogger Michael Nabil Sanad was sentenced to 3 years in prison by a military court on charges of insulting the armed forces and spreading false news in a blog post published last March. He had accused the military of conducting virginity tests on female protesters, a claim that later proved to be true. Sanad spent much of his incarceration, which came to an end soon before the anniversary of the revolution last January, on hunger strike. And then there's the aforementioned Alaa Abdel Fattah, who was released on the 25th of December after almost 2 months in prison. And he was arrested on charges of inciting violence against the military during the mass burial demonstrations on October the 9th, during which hundreds of people were injured and 27 died in some of the worst violence seen in Egypt since Mubarak was ousted from power. Meanwhile, the small Gulf nation of Bahrain has had incredibly limited mainstream media attention, despite a growing popular uprising facing an ever-increasing and brutal crackdown. Since protests against the reigning Al Khalifa family broke out on the 14th of February last year, it is estimated that 90 journalists have been targeted in the country, with visas for foreign reporters being denied in recent weeks. Much information is coming out of the small nation through citizen and social media, and several prolific tweeters, such as activist Mariam Al-Khawaja and her family, have built up trust with domestic and international followers. However, perhaps the other side of the coin is that on-the-ground documentation rather than analysis, as a result of the on-the-ground documentation, we're not receiving objective, impartial reporting or much analysis. So there is clearly work to be done here, but at least citizen media goes some way in turning up the volume. And of course, it cannot be overstated that these are just a handful of cases among many, and it is important also to note that the region is highly diverse in terms of the sophistication of censorship and the struggle against it. But they are rather indicative of the power of citizen journalism, that is such that their bravery is met with such aggressive force and threats of silence. And so just to make a few final remarks, and I hope we haven't run over, journalism, as I mentioned at the beginning, is becoming less of a product and more of a process. We now have more opportunities than ever before to strengthen our craft by utilizing the online tools available to us and by incorporating the voices of the audience into our storytelling. Our work is becoming more layered, textual, and far deeper. And this, of course, throws up some soul-searching questions. What is journalism for? What is its value? But if, as media critic Jay Rosen says, journalism gets better the more people who do it, then perhaps we should embrace this opportunity to improve the craft that plays such an important function in our lives. If journalism is about seeking truth, why should we turn away from the methods available to seek that truth? And finally, with citizens more able than ever before to tell their stories, we can see that those who cannot enjoy the privilege of freedom of expression are finding more and more ways to assert this basic human right. They do this in spite of the aggression that they face for speaking out, painting a picture of bravery to foreign onlookers. And it is this bravery of citizen journalism that Global Voices and Index on Censorship, the two organizations that I'm very honored to represent and be part of, seeks to highlight and reinforce to the rest of the world. And I hope that I have done so today, and thank you for listening.
Because I do have a question that I'm most interested in. You've described this brave new world of citizen journalism and citizen journalists, and you described the translators. I think that's wonderful. Somebody who's done quite a lot of translation work in various languages myself. All these people doing it on a voluntary basis. Then there are the 500 journalists who are mentioned. How many have you had to chuck out?
I'm not in. Well. I'm not entirely sure about our attrition rate. There is, of course, a problem of volunteer fatigue because all of our authors operate on a voluntary basis. And so if they're not getting paid, then, of course, the incentive does sometimes decrease. But we have grown exponentially. When I joined in 2009, we were sort of numbering around 300, and these days we're closer to the 500 mark.
You never have any problems with you have an editorial line or an editorial consensus and somebody breaks that consensus, somebody doesn't toe the line, as it were?
We do have a group of sub-editors who meticulously check through stories. And editorial objectivity is an issue. And as a journalist myself, that is one of my personal concerns. But our core team and our management team come from a journalism background. And so our stories are checked and read through before they go online. And
you mentioned attrition, you mentioned people not being able to necessarily earn a living. That is one of the virtues of the traditional structures of journalism, that people often could earn a very comfy living, which led to comfy habits, but it also gave people, in the best case scenarios, independence. How does that compare with the citizen journalist model?
I'm sorry, I don't really understand your question.
The citizen journalist needs to earn a living.
Yes.
Yeah. How does that work?
A lot of them do. A lot of them do this on the side. A lot of them contribute when they can, volunteer when they're able to. So they don't necessarily rely on this to make a living. Indeed, I don't think they could. But they do so out of good faith and a real dedication to the cause.
We had a very interesting episode recently here in Germany. It's an ongoing episode. We had the discussion about who's going to be the new federal president of Germany. It's a symbolic office, but it's nevertheless relatively important. And the man who got the nomination from Angela Merkel and her party, Joachim Gauck, almost overnight was suddenly facing accusations in the blogosphere that he had attacked the Occupy movement. He had described the Occupy movement as naive. That he had appeared to describe a man who had published a book that was full of racial prejudice, ethnic prejudice. That he appeared to describe him as courageous. Other charges were made against him in the blogosphere. The next day, 24 hours later, a lot of the more conventional press, a lot of the German newspapers showed that those quotes had been inaccurate. But that really didn't filter down into the blogosphere the following days. The accusations that had been made against him remained in the system, as it were. How do you correct the incorrections? That was a question that you asked yourself. It's an important issue. It is
a vital issue, and the immediacy and widespread nature of social media mean that it is really hard. It is difficult to get a correction, especially when sort of the impressions have already been made of a particular person or an issue. But I think in the example that I mentioned, it is possible to create a more transparent environment by seeking a correction, by asking questions from other journalists and your followers. And I think it would need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. But the tools are there to make for a more transparent environment.
Anybody else got any questions? Good. Two.
Can I go first, please? Because
we've got one.
I'm just going to ask a short question. Then you can maybe go on that. My question is, with all these citizen journalists, don't you think that often it's also one-sided? Because often it's the opposition or activists who use this tool right now. So you can say, okay, it's the other side of you have the government and then the opposition who use this tool. But don't you think that it's also quite one-sided? Because like a certain group, younger, also like Western educated people often use this, or people who have friends in the West who use this tool predominantly. So don't you think that of course it shows a lot of criticism, but like from the personal experience, just one-sided view. So sometimes I feel that even though it's really important that we see this and it's important that we get this criticism, it doesn't reflect on the whole picture. But we get the feeling it does, but I think it doesn't, because the ones who support the government, for example, even though it's repressive, they don't use these tools, and so we don't get their official opinion on this matter. So how do you think, how to deal with that? How can we get an accurate picture of like everyone tweeting and not just a certain opposition group using these tools under each other? Yeah. Thank you.
I think that's a really important point. And I think mainstream media has some way to go in making sure that the news that they report is also accurate, especially foreign correspondents. So, for instance, in China, we look at the Chinese blogosphere and we look at how netizens are asserting their right to freedom of expression, but not all of them are speaking out against the Communist Party. Many are very much in favor. So it's a question of being able to traverse the social media terrain and see who is saying what and being able to represent that clearly. And I think sort of just being literate from a social media point of view really goes some way into handling that. But if we're incorporating more voices, then, I mean, of course, as you said, sometimes it is just another voice. It's not necessarily a group of diverse voices. But that obviously has to be seen on a case-by-case basis.
Hi, this is Josh Wolf. You spoke about volunteer fatigue, but I'm curious whether, in your experience with Global Voices, if you've noticed whether there's certain type of reporting that volunteers just aren't very well adept at covering, as opposed to certain reporting that's better for full-time reporters, and what sort of reporting that would be.
That's a really interesting question. Off the top of my head, I don't have an answer for you, I'm afraid. I would have to check and then get back to you, but that's definitely something worth looking into, and thanks for flagging it up.
Yeah, sorry you didn't get an answer to that. It's a really good question.
Well, it's a good question.
It was a very good question.
It was too good a question, so you're not going to get an answer.
That's the way it works.
That's mainstream journalism, you know. That's old.
That's the Murdoch press.
That's the old Murdoch press, yes. I want to ask a question, sorry. Sorry, Marta, you said, what? Stand up. You said journalism gets. You quoted Jay Rosen.
I did.
Very approvingly, saying, "Journalism gets better the more people do it." That would kind of like go against the grain, clearly, of me as a kind of ancient hack who's been over 40 years in the business. Could you explain that? Why does journalism get better the more the people do it? You could say, you could argue, actually, the more the people do it, the worse it gets, because, you know, it's all undifferentiated, and who's to make the judgment that it's better?
Yeah. I think Jay Rosen's argument was, if journalism as a product is about serving its readers, is about producing coherent and accurate information for its readers, then if we're incorporating our readers into the coverage, then that improves. So if we're relying on Twitter and Citizen reports to follow coverage of a riot breaking out in London, then rather than sitting behind a desk and following breaking news coverage, we're really sort of seeing where the trouble spots are, and we're really on top of developments far more quickly. And I mean, I definitely see your point, and coming from your point of view, there are cons to sort of widening the pool of journalism and incorporating more voices, because then, of course, editorial objectivity, as I mentioned, becomes even more difficult. How do you evaluate XYZ? How do you verify this source? I mean, are we hearing more noise rather than information? But as I mentioned earlier, I think media literacy goes some way into solving that problem.
So we are very lucky that we are talking about journalism. In the Orient, they are talking about militias. So the more that the lecture was successful and technical, but thanks to the lecturer, because she passed on the Arab Spring. That's why I want you to stand up for a minute in respect and in silence for the martyrs of journalism in Syria who died lately. And I also want to pass through the failure of journalist union who could not contribute to the crisis all over the world at all. Thank you.
If the role of new media is expanding, you might assume that the role of more traditional media is diminishing. And if that is the case, what is the new diminished role
of traditional media? Wow, that's a fantastic question. Is there a new diminished role of traditional media?
I don't know, I'm curious, because certainly over lunch, that was one of the fears that I sensed was with us at the table.
I don't think new media will replace traditional journalism. We still need professionals to help us evaluate information, to help us differentiate truth from rumor. I think, I'm not sure if there is necessarily a diminishing. I think where focus should be paid is on strengthening the sort of competing forces that we have at the moment into creating a stronger media that both fuses old and new forms.
With you all the way.
Thank you.
I think that's all we've got time for, but it's been very good. Yeah, very invigorating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.